The January of 1889 arrived on the high plains of eastern Wyoming the way all the worst things arrive. Not gradually, not with any warning a person could act on, but all at once like a door swung open onto the dark side of the world. And in the hour before dawn, on a morning so cold that the stars seemed brittle, overhead a woman named Eleanor Voss stood alone in her barn, with her eyes closed and both hands pressed flat against the earthen wall. And the people who knew her were certain she had finally lost her mind. She was 38 years old. She had buried her husband. She had kept her children alive through 2 brutal winters without help from anyone who hadn't eventually stopped offering it. She had held this homestead together with the particular ferocity of a person who has already survived the worst thing she can imagine and discovered to her own grim surprise that there is always something worse waiting beyond it. And she was standing in her barn before sunrise with her palms against the dirt wall, eyes shut, breathing slow, not praying, not grieving, not doing any of the things the women of that stretch of Wyoming plains did in the dark hours when the cold pressed in and the loneliness pressed harder. She was measuring. She had been measuring for 4 years. She had a system. She pressed her right hand against the wall at shoulder height and her left hand against the air at the same level, and she held them both there long enough for her skin to settle into what each surface had to offer. And then she compared the 2 sensations with the focused attention of a person conducting an experiment they have no language to describe but cannot stop performing. The wall was cooler than her hand. The air was cooler than the wall, but the wall was not as cool as the air. And in ways that she had spent 4 winters learning to read with the sensitivity of her fingertips, rather than any instrument, the wall felt different from the air, in a way that went beyond temperature alone. The air moved. The air changed. The air had a quality of aliveness to it, a responsiveness to the wind outside and the body heat of the animals inside and the hour of the night that the wall entirely lacked. The wall simply was. It did not respond to the wind. It did not respond to the hour. It did not swing toward cold in the dead of night and relent toward something more bearable as the noon sun reached the roof boards. It held its temperature the way a stone holds its weight, not because of any effort, but because of what it was made of and what was around it and how far it sat from the violent, swinging, unreliable surface of the world. Eleanor Voss had understood this with her hands long before she understood it with her mind. And she had understood it with her mind for 2 years, before she understood what it meant she had to do. She opened her eyes. The barn around her was gray in the pre-dawn. The cattle shifted and breathed. The smell of hay and animals and cold earth was so familiar to her now that she barely registered it, the way a person stops hearing the sound of a river they live beside. She looked down at her hands. She flexed her fingers against the cold. Then she turned and walked back through the barn to the place in the floor where the trapdoor sat flush with the surrounding boards, and she pulled it open, and she descended the rope ladder into the space below, and she was home. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because the hole did not always exist, and the woman who dug it was not always the woman she had become by the January of 1889. To understand Eleanor Voss, you have to go back to the spring of 1884, when she and her husband, Samuel, arrived on the high plains of eastern Wyoming with a wagon loaded past, raising 2 children under the age of 7. and a determination that the people who sold them their land patent probably found uncomfortable to look at directly. Samuel Voss was a quiet man. This is the first thing anyone who knew him would tell you, and it was not a criticism. Quiet men on the frontier were often the ones who lasted. The loud ones spent their energy on declaration. The quiet ones spent theirs on observation, on the slow accumulation of practical knowledge on the work itself. Samuel was the kind of man who could repair nearly anything he could get his hands on, and who approached every problem with the same patient, methodical attention he gave to mending fence wire, not rushing, not forcing, just working the problem until it yielded. He had chosen the land carefully. The shallow valley sat lower than the surrounding plain, which meant the wind came over it at an angle that reduced its worst violence, at least in theory. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property was reliable even in dry years. The soil was workable. The graze was good. What Samuel had not fully accounted for, and what no one who had not wintered on that stretch of land could fully account for, was the cold. Not ordinary cold. Not the cold of an Indiana winter or an Ohio November, or any of the cold that Samuel and Eleanor had grown up with and understood as a thing to be endured and managed. This was a different category of cold entirely. This was cold that had traveled undisturbed across what felt like half the continent, gathering force and indifference as it came, arriving not as weather but as a condition of the world, as fundamental and implacable as gravity, as personal as a hand around your throat. The first winter was hard. They survived it. The second winter was harder. They survived that too. And by the third winter, the winter of 1886 to 1887, Eleanor and Samuel had developed the kind of relationship with extreme cold that only comes from having lived inside it long enough to learn its specific cruelties and its very limited mercies. It was Samuel who started the notebook. He had always been a man who wrote things down. Not in any literary sense, his entries were spare functional. The records of a practical mind, tracking practical observations. Temperature at dawn, temperature at midday, temperature at nightfall, wind direction, wind speed estimated by feel and by what it did to the animals and to the dry grass on the southern slope, how much wood the stove burned on the worst nights, how the cattle behaved in the days before a major storm. Eleanor had her own observations, and she recorded them separately in her mind in the layered and precise way that women who have managed complex households without assistance learn to track the world. She noticed things Samuel's notebook did not capture. She noticed that the cattle, when left to find their own shelter against a storm, did not press against the walls of the barn the way you would expect a cold animal to press against whatever solid surface was available. They moved toward the middle. They bunched together in the center of the space, and they stood there shifting occasionally, breathing their collective warmth into the air between them. She noticed that the air down where they stood, not up where the cold infiltrated from the eaves, not at the level where a person's face was, but down at the level of the animal's flanks, held something that the corners and the walls did not. Not warmth exactly. Not comfort by any measure that word meant anything in a Wyoming January. But a difference. A real one, something her hands could feel when she reached down into that bovine huddle on the worst mornings. Something warmer than the alternatives. She filed this away. She did not yet know what to do with it. The observation that changed everything came in February of 1887. on a day when the ground was frozen hard as iron, and Eleanor needed to set a new fence post in the section of line that had blown over in a storm 2 weeks earlier. She dug, or rather she tried to dig. The surface of the ground resisted the post hole digger with the density of stone, and she worked at it for an hour before she got through the first 8 inches, and then she got through the next 8 in half the time. And by the time she was down 2 feet, she was working in soil that had a different quality entirely. Not soft, not warm, but not the same killing hardness as the surface. And at 3 feet, she stopped digging and knelt down and pressed both hands against the earthen walls of the hole she had made. Different. The word was inadequate, but it was the only word she had. It was different down there. The cold was present, but it was not the cold of the surface, not the aggressive, penetrating, animated cold that seemed almost to have intent, that found every gap in your clothing and drove itself inward with what felt like purpose. This cold was still. It was indifferent. It sat at a temperature that was low by any human standard, but that felt to her hands against those earthen walls almost stable. Almost as though the earth around it had made a decision about temperature and stuck to that decision, regardless of what the surface was doing. She knelt there for longer than she needed to. She pressed her hands against the walls of that fence post hole in February on the high plains of Wyoming, and she thought about what she was feeling, and she thought about the cattle in the middle of the barn, and she thought about something she could not yet name. Then she finished setting the fence post and went back to her house and did not say anything about it to anyone, because she did not yet know what to say. 2 months later, in the spring of 1887, Samuel Voss died of a fever. He had been sick for 11 days. Eleanor had done everything she knew how to do, which was more than most people could have done, and less than what was needed. The nearest doctor was a day's ride south. She sent word. The doctor came. He looked at Samuel and he was honest with her about what honesty required him to say, and he left medicine that helped with the fever's violence without touching its cause. And on a Thursday morning in April, with the light coming in pale and clean through the window, he had asked her to open. Samuel Voss died quietly in the manner of quiet men. He was 41 years old. Eleanor sat beside him for a long time. Ada came in and stood in the doorway. Owen was asleep in the other room, too young to fully understand, and old enough to know that something had permanently changed in the shape of their lives. Eleanor looked at her husband's face for a long time. Then she got up because there were things that needed doing, and she did them. In the weeks after Samuel's death, going through his belongings with the careful attention of someone preserving what could be preserved and making practical decisions about what could not, Eleanor found his notebook. She had known about the notebook. She had seen him writing in it on winter evenings by the stove. She had never read it because it was his, and their marriage had been built on a foundation of mutual respect that included the understanding that a person's private observations were their own. But Samuel was gone now, and the notebook was here, and she opened it. Most of it was what she had expected: temperature readings, wind observations, notes about the cattle, about the crops, about the condition of various sections of fence line, the handwriting of a practical man tracking practical things. But near the back, in entries dated to the winter of 1886 to 1887, the hardest winter they had survived together, there were pages that were different. Samuel had been thinking about the cold. Not just tracking it, but thinking about it working through an idea in the way that he worked through mechanical problems, turning it over. examining it from different angles, writing down what he observed, and then writing down what the observations suggested. He had noticed the cattle in the center of the barn. He had noticed the quality of the air at the level of their flanks. He had gone further than Eleanor had gone, at least in written form. He had thought about root cellars, about the way the temperature below ground stayed stable through the summer, cooler than the air above. And then he had begun to wonder whether the same principle applied to winter, whether below a certain depth, the earth stopped following the surface temperature, whether it held something steadier. He had written in his careful hand, "The ground does not swing. This is the thing to understand. Everything above ground swings with the weather. The ground below a man's depth does not swing." I want to know what use a person could make of that. And then there were no more entries on that subject, because the following spring he had gotten sick. And then he had died, and the idea had died with him. Or rather, it had waited. Eleanor sat with the notebook in her lap for a long time. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry then. What she felt was more complex than grief, though grief was part of it. She felt the specific weight of a thing left unfinished, a question asked and not answered, an observation made and not followed to its conclusion. She looked at his handwriting. The ground does not swing. She thought about the fence post hole, about her hands against the earthen walls at 3 feet down, about the cold that was present, but not the cold of the surface, the cold that had made its decision and kept it. Samuel had seen it too. He had seen it and been working towards something, and then the spring had taken him before he could get there. She closed the notebook. She held it against her chest for a moment. Then she put it on the shelf where she kept things that mattered. And she went to make supper for her children. And she began in the deliberate and methodical way that was entirely her own to think about what came next. The idea did not arrive fully formed. Ideas like Eleanor's never do. They come the way the understanding of a new language comes, not in a single revelatory moment, but in an accumulation of small recognitions, each one building on the last, until one day you realize you have been thinking in the new language for a while without noticing the transition. Through the summer of 1887 and into the winter that followed, Eleanor observed. She observed the way a scientist observes, which is to say, she observed without deciding in advance what she expected to find, and she recorded what she found in her own notebook, which she kept separately from Samuel's, and which was like his, a record of a practical mind, tracking practical things. She noted the date in the fall when the ground temperature at post-hole depth began to diverge significantly from the surface temperature. She noted how far this divergence extended, and how it changed as winter deepened. She dug test holes in different parts of the property, different exposures, different soil compositions, and she noted how the temperature profiles differed between them. She noted that the spot under the center of the barn, where the soil was protected from direct weather by the structure above it, behaved differently from the exposed ground at the edge of the property. She was building a picture. She was building it slowly in the way that people who cannot afford to be wrong build things with attention to every detail and skepticism about every conclusion until the evidence became impossible to argue with. By the summer of 1888, she had enough. She had enough to know that what she felt in the fence post hole had not been imagination. She had enough to know that Samuel's instinct had been correct. She had enough to know that What the ground offered, that steadiness, that indifference to the swinging violence of the surface, was real, was measurable, was consistent, and was available to anyone willing to go down far enough to find it. She also had enough to know that what she was thinking about doing next was going to require an explanation she did not yet know how to give. She told Ada first. This was a deliberate choice. Ada was 12 years old that summer, and Eleanor had learned in the years since Samuel's death that her daughter was the person in the household most likely to ask the questions that needed asking. Not because she was skeptical. Ada trusted her mother with the wholehearted completeness of a child who has watched a parent hold everything together through things that would have broken most people. But because she was curious, and her curiosity expressed itself in practical questions that forced Eleanor to examine her own thinking in useful ways. They sat on the porch in the long August evening, the light going gold and slow across the grass, and Eleanor explained what she wanted to do. She talked about the ground temperature. She talked about what she had measured over the past 2 winters. She talked about what Samuel had written in his notebook. She talked about the cattle in the center of the barn, and the fence post hole, and the specific quality of the cold at depth versus the cold of the surface. Ada listened with her knees pulled up to her chest, and her eyes on the middle distance, the posture she adopted when she was thinking hard. When Eleanor finished, Ada was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "How deep would we have to go?" Not, "Can we do this?" Not, "Are you sure?" How deep would we have to go? Eleanor had raised this child right. Far enough that the ground above is doing most of the work, Eleanor said. As deep as a man is tall, maybe a little more, and wide enough for the small animals, and for us to sleep there on the worst nights. Ada thought about this. "The entrance should be inside the barn," she said, "so we don't have to go outside to get to it." That's exactly what I was thinking. Owen they told together that evening after supper. He was 9, and he received the information with the expression Eleanor had come to recognize as his deepest form of engagement. A kind of focused stillness. His father's stillness that meant he was working through the practical implications faster than he could articulate them. He asked one question. "Can I help dig?" "Every day," Eleanor said. She started the following morning. The labor involved was by any honest accounting enormous. She began by pulling up the planking in the central section of the barn floor, stacking the boards carefully along the wall, because she would need them again. The ground beneath was hard-packed and dry-compacted by years of animal traffic, and the weight of the structure above it. She started with the pickaxe and moved to the shovel, working the loose material into a wooden bucket that Ada would haul up and carry to the low, scrubby area behind the barn that Eleanor had always meant to level. She worked every morning from first light until the midday heat made the hole too close and airless to breathe in comfortably, and she worked again in the late afternoon until the light failed. Ada worked beside her in the mornings, hauling and spreading. Owen worked on weekends, and he turned out to have an instinctive sense of 3-dimensional space that Eleanor had not anticipated he was the first to notice when a wall was beginning to angle without them meaning it to. And he had a way of checking the corners with a kind of intuitive geometry that kept the whole excavation honest. The hole went down slowly. Sweat froze on her forehead in the cold mornings. The earth resisted in layers, hard at the surface, slightly softer in the middle. Strata, harder again where the soil composition changed at depth. She worked through all of it, She had no other option, and she had something better than options. She had a reason. The ground does not swing. Samuel's words. She thought about them often in the whole in the way that you think about something a person said when they were alive and you didn't understand it fully, and now they are gone. And understanding it feels like a form of conversation you can still have with them. She was down 4 feet when word got out. It got out the way everything got out on that stretch of the Wyoming plains, which is to say that someone saw something and mentioned it to someone else, and that someone else mentioned it at the general store in town. And within 2 weeks, the general consensus along the homesteading community of that particular valley was that Eleanor Voss had lost her husband and was now apparently losing her mind. Harlan Prescott came by on a Thursday afternoon in September with his brother Clem, and he did not come to help. Harlan Prescott was a large man with a large voice and the particular confidence of someone who has been right about enough things that he has stopped carefully examining the possibility that he might be wrong about others. He ran cattle on the flatland to the west. He had made offers to buy Eleanor's place in the 2 years since Samuel's death, and Eleanor had declined each offer with the same even voice and the same set of her shoulders. And Harlan had taken these refusals with the imperfectly concealed irritation of a man who considers a woman managing a homestead alone to be a temporary situation awaiting a sensible resolution. He stood at the edge of the open barn floor, looking down into the excavation with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that he was not quite bothering to keep private. "What in the Lord's name are you building down there, Eleanor?" "A room," she said from the bottom of the hole. She did not stop working. "A room." He said it back to her the way you repeat something that doesn't make sense, hoping the repetition will clarify it. "Under your barn floor." "Under my barn floor." There was a pause. She could hear Clem shifting his weight somewhere behind Harlan, the specific sound of someone who would rather be elsewhere. "You know what they keep underground, Eleanor," Harlan said. "Things that are dead." She kept digging. She did not respond to this. She had found in her experience with Harlan Prescott that he found silence more unsettling than any argument she could make, and she had learned to use this strategically. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You want to keep your cattle underground, like coal miners." Still, she said nothing. He put his hat back on. "I'm going to tell you this as a neighborly concern," he said, with the tone of a man who has decided that his concern is the important thing here. "People are talking. They're saying you're not managing well out here on your own. And this," he gestured at the hole, "this is not going to help that particular conversation." Eleanor set her shovel down. She looked up at him from the bottom of the excavation, which meant she was looking up at a man who was already tall from a position that gave him every physical advantage of height and angle. She was aware of this. She used it anyway. "Harlan," she said, "I appreciate the visit. I'll be back to work now." He stood there for another moment, working his jaw. Then he turned and walked out of the barn, and Clem followed him, and Eleanor picked up her shovel. She did not watch them go, but she heard just before the barn door swung shut a sound that she filed away and thought about later that evening. Clem Prescott, following his brother out into the yard, had paused at the barn door. She heard his footsteps stop. She heard the quality of silence that a person makes when they are looking at something and thinking about it. It lasted only a moment, Then he kept walking. He had looked back. She thought about that. Aldrich Brenner came later that same week, and his visit was different in every way from the Prescotts. Brenner was 60 years old, German-born, a man who had spent 15 years in the coal mines of western Pennsylvania before a combination of saved wages and sheer determination had allowed him to start over on the surface, raising cattle on a small rise about 3 miles north of Eleanor's place. He was not a man who wasted words. He was not, in Eleanor's experience, a man who said anything he did not mean or who failed to mean something when he said it. He rode up on a gray morning and tied his horse and walked into the barn and stood at the edge of the excavation and looked down for a long time without saying anything at all. Eleanor was working. She let him look. Finally, he said in the careful English he had learned as an adult and spoken precisely ever since, "You are going perhaps 5 feet." "6, Eleanor said. "Maybe a little more." He nodded as though this confirmed something he had been calculating. He was quiet again for a moment. The cattle shifted. The wind pressed against the barn walls. "The air exchange," he said. "How are you managing it?" Eleanor stopped digging. She looked up at him. She had been thinking about the walls and the floor and the ceiling and the entrance. She had been thinking about the lining and the stovepipe. She had not yet thought with any specificity about the air. "I haven't fully worked that out yet," she said. Brenner nodded again. He reached into his coat and produced a short stem pipe, which he did not light, only held. "In a closed space underground," he said, "the air goes bad faster than you expect. Carbon from the stove, body heat, animals." He paused. "You need a vent. Small is enough. Direction matters south-facing. If you can manage it high on the wall with a flap, you can control from inside." He put the pipe in his pocket. "The depth you are going," he said, "should give you what you are looking for. The temperature at that depth on this property with the cover of the barn above." He paused. "It will hold." Then he put his hat back on, turned, and walked out of the barn. Eleanor stood at the bottom of her hole and watched the space where he had been standing for a moment. He had not said she was right. He had not said she was wrong. He had asked about the air exchange, told her what he knew about it, made a calculation she had not asked him to make, and left. She thought about what it meant that Aldrich Brenner had said the depth should give her what she was looking for. She went back to digging. By October, the excavation was complete. Eleanor had gone down, by her reckoning, as deep as a man was tall, and perhaps a hand's length more deep enough that when you stood at the bottom and looked up through the trapdoor in the barn floor above the rectangle of barn-lit air overhead, felt like a window in someone else's ceiling. She had cut the walls as straight as she could manage and lined them with planking salvaged from an outbuilding that had collapsed 2 winters back. She had cut drainage channels along the base of the north wall, where the soil ran a little wetter, angling them toward a small sump in the far corner that could be baled when needed. The ceiling was the heaviest work. She used the best timber she had for the main beams, running them across the width of the space, and then she laid planking across those and packed the gaps with a mixture of dried grass and the clay-heavy soil from the deepest section of the excavation. She tested it from above with her own weight and with a full hay bale. It held. For the floor, she tamped the earth flat and covered it first with straw and then with boards laid loose, not nailed, so they could be lifted if moisture came up from below. The vent she built exactly as Brenner had described a channel, running at a slight upward angle to a small opening on the south face of the barn's base, barely larger than a man's fist, covered with a wooden flap on a pivot that could be opened or closed from inside the room below. She spent an afternoon working out the angle and the size, thinking about airflow, thinking about what Brenner had said about direction mattering. She installed the stove, a small iron box stove she had arranged to have shipped from Cheyenne the previous spring, on the understanding that she would need it for something, though she had not yet known exactly what. She ran the stovepipe up through the ceiling and through the barn floor above, and out through the barn's south wall near the eaves. She sealed the penetrations with clay packed tight, and then with metal flashing hammered to the wood. The entrance was a trap door in the new ceiling with a frame of doubled timber at the edges, and a rope ladder that Ada could descend without difficulty and that Owen could manage with effort. She rigged a pull system from below using a rope threaded through a simple wooden toggle that allowed the trap door to be opened or closed from either side. And then, one evening in mid-October, when the daylight was getting short and the nights were already edged with the serious cold that told you the serious cold was coming, Eleanor lit a lantern and descended the ladder and stood in the finished space for the first time and simply looked around. It was not large. It was not beautiful. It was a room in the earth lined with salvaged planking and smelling of fresh-cut wood and clay, and the particular cold mineral smell of excavated soil that she had been living with for 2 months. The ceiling was low enough that she had to be careful about her head in the center of the space. The light from the lantern threw warm shadows into the corners and left the edges of the room in a dimness that felt, she realized, peaceful rather than oppressive. She held the lantern up and turned slowly. The first thing she noticed was the quiet. Not the silence of an empty room, but a quality of stillness she had not experienced before, or rather had not experienced above ground. There was no sense of wind. There was no vibration from the gusts pressing against the barn walls above. There was no creaking of boards in the shifting air. No feeling of the vast open country pressing in from every direction, the way it always did even inside a building on those plains. Down here, none of that existed. The world above was going about its weather, and it did not reach her. The second thing she noticed was the temperature. She held one hand near the lantern and then moved it away, held it flat against the earthen wall and held it there. The wall was cool, significantly cool by the standard of a warm room, but it was not the killing cold of the January air. It was not the aggressive, penetrating cold that had a quality of intention to it. It was something steadier, something that did not respond to her hand the way the air above ground responded to a person's presence. It did not warm, but it also did not threaten. It simply held its temperature indifferent and stable as it had held it every day of every season, since before any person had ever set foot on this particular corner of Wyoming. She pressed both palms flat against the wall. She closed her eyes. The ground does not swing. She stayed down there for a long time that evening, long after she had seen what she needed to see and confirmed what she had come to confirm. She stayed because the quality of the stillness was doing something to her that she had not anticipated, something that she did not have a ready vocabulary for because the feeling was not one she had been in the habit of experiencing. In the 2.5 years since Samuel had died, Eleanor Voss had been managing. She had been managing the way you manage when the alternative is not managing, which is to say with a kind of fierce, comprehensive attention to everything that needed attention, and a deliberate decision not to think about the things she could not address. The grief was real and she had felt it, but she had felt it in the margins of the work, in the spaces between tasks, in the 5 minutes before sleep, and the first moments after waking. She had not had the luxury of feeling it in the middle of the day, in the middle of the doing. What she felt in the room below her barn, sitting on the low bench she had built along the east wall, with the lantern burning and the earthen walls holding their patient temperature around her, was something quieter than confidence and something stronger than comfort. It was the specific feeling of a problem solved, not a problem made easier, not a problem deferred, a problem actually genuinely finally solved through 2 years of observation and 1 season of physical labor, by herself in a place where most people had told her it could not be done. She thought about Samuel's notebook, about his handwriting on the page. I want to know what use a person could make of that. She thought about the fence post hole in February 1887, her hands against the walls at 3 feet down, the cold that was present but not the cold of the surface. She thought about the cattle in the center of the barn, standing in the warmest available air, with the instinctive sureness of creatures who have not been educated out of trusting what their bodies tell them. She sat there in the quiet until the lantern began to burn low, and then she climbed back up into the barn and closed the trap door behind her and went to check on her children. The knowledge that she had built something traveled the way knowledge always traveled on that stretch of the plains, which is to say, it traveled whether Eleanor Voss wanted it to or not. Everett Halston heard about it from his wife Dorothea, who had ridden over to bring a jar of preserved summer peaches and had come home with a detailed account of the opening in the barn floor and a complicated expression that her husband eventually identified as genuine worry. Halston mentioned it to the Prescott brothers the next time he saw them at the grist mill in town, and Harlan Prescott said something about root cellars that got a laugh from the men within earshot. And the phrase that circulated from there, the phrase that reached Eleanor's ears within a week, was that she had spent the better part of 2 months digging herself a glorified root cellar and calling it an invention. Eleanor heard this and registered it and did not respond to it. Dorothea Halston came back a second time, genuinely worried, genuinely kind, and asked whether Eleanor was sleeping enough, whether she was managing the grief, whether there was anything the community could do. Eleanor thanked her for the preserves. She showed her the trapdoor open, the ladder descending into the space below. Dorothea looked at it for a long moment with an expression that Eleanor read correctly as a person confronting something they do not quite know how to fit into their existing understanding of the world. I could come down, Dorothea said without great conviction. You're welcome to, Eleanor said. Dorothea did not come down. She stood at the edge of the opening and looked into the lamplight below, and then stepped back. She told Eleanor she hoped it would help with the winter. She rode home. And then came the night that Eleanor, going out to check on the barn before bed, found something she had not arranged and had not expected. Owen discovered it first. He came in from the barn with the particular expression of a child who has witnessed something he cannot explain and is not certain what category to put it in. He stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Mama, the mice." She followed him out. In the light of the lantern she held over the open trap door, she counted 7 of the barn's resident mice settled in the lower room. They had found their way in through a gap in the planking she had not yet chinked, and they were arranged in the far corner of the space with the specific relaxed purposefulness of animals that have decided they are exactly where they intend to be. She had not invited them. She had not shown them the space. She had built it for cattle and children, and these 7 small animals had entirely on their own initiative found it and assessed it, and concluded that it was the right place to be. Owen looked at them and then looked at his mother. "How did they know?" he asked. Eleanor held the lantern over the opening and looked at the mice in the corner of the room she had spent 2 months digging, and she felt something she would have had difficulty articulating, but that was close to vindication, though it came from an entirely unexpected source. "They knew," she said, "because they haven't been told not to trust what they feel." She looked at the mice for another moment. "They knew before we did," she said. "They always know before we do." She chinked the gap the following morning, but carefully leaving the mice their access. As far as she was concerned, they had earned it. The November air was beginning to have weight to it now, the first real bite of the serious cold that would be followed. Everyone who had lived through enough Wyoming winters knew by something worse. The light was short. The sky had a particular quality in the evenings, a pewter flatness that the long-timers read like a text. Eleanor Voss had read it too. And now, for the first time since Samuel's death, she had a place to be when what the sky was promising finally arrived. She descended the ladder one more evening in late October alone, and lit the small stove for the first time, and sat on her bench and held her coffee in both hands, and watched the flame through the stove's iron grate while the structure above her creaked in a rising wind. Down here she could not hear the wind. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear the small sounds of the earth settling around her, the ordinary sounds of a thing that has been in the same place for a very long time and intends to remain there. She pressed one hand against the wall as she always did. The earth held its temperature. It did not swing. It had made its decision, and it kept it the way a well-built thing keeps its shape, not through effort, but through the quality of what it was made of, and what surrounded it, and how far it sat from the violence of the surface world. She closed her eyes. The lantern burned. The stove clicked and settled. Above her, Wyoming prepared its worst. She was ready. The November that preceded the worst storm in a decade arrived with deceptive gentleness. The days were short, but clear. The light thin and pale as washed linen. The kind of light that makes the plains look almost delicate in the middle hours when it slants low across the grass and turns the dry stalks to gold. The temperatures dropped at night and recovered partway by afternoon in the manner of a season that has not yet fully committed to its worst intentions. There were days that week when Dorothea Halston hung washing on the line, and it dried before dark, and Clem Prescott rode out to check the fence line on the western boundary without bothering with his heaviest coat. It was the kind of November that made you think, if you were not paying close attention, that the winter ahead might be manageable. Eleanor Voss was paying close attention. She had been paying close attention since the first morning of the month when she stepped outside before dawn and felt something in the air that she did not have a single word for, but that her body registered with the specific alertness of an animal that has learned to read certain kinds of silence as warnings. The cold that morning was not exceptional by Wyoming standards. It was the quality behind the cold that was different. A density, a settled weight, a sense that the temperature was not passing through on its way somewhere else, but was instead establishing itself, making its arrangements, preparing for something longer than an ordinary cold snap. She wrote in her notebook, "The air has made a decision. I don't know yet what the decision is, but I can feel that it has been made." Then she went to tend the cattle and to check, as she did every morning now, on the room below the barn floor. She had been running the experiment for 3 weeks. The 3 youngest calves, too small and too new to the world to be reliable survivors of a serious Wyoming cold, spent their nights in the lower room. Eleanor brought them down each evening before the temperature dropped, and brought them back up in the warmer middle hours of the day. And she tracked everything: how much wood the small stove consumed, what temperature the space held at its coldest point, how the animals behaved compared to the animals that spent the night in the main barn above. The numbers were telling her something she had expected to hear, but that still had the quality of revelation when she saw it in her own handwriting. On the coldest nights of those 3 weeks, when the main barn required its corner stove to run nearly without rest, to keep the temperature above the point where the adult cattle grew miserable, the small room below used less than a third of the wood she had estimated it would need. Less than a third. And the calves in the lower room, the smallest animals, the most vulnerable ones, the ones that had lost condition fastest in previous winters, were not just surviving. They were steady. Their coats were full. They fed normally. They behaved like animals that were not spending their energy fighting the cold, because the cold was not reaching them the way it reached everything above ground. On those same nights, Eleanor sat in the lower room with Ada beside her, reading by lantern light, and she felt not warmth. She was always careful about this word, always honest with herself about what the space actually offered. She felt the specific quality of air that does not move when the world above it is in violent motion. The stove's heat built slowly and held. The earthen walls gave nothing away. And above them she could hear the barn planking creak in the wind. Gusts could hear the cattle shifting and stamping in the main space. Could hear Wyoming conducting its ordinary business of trying to drive every living thing south. Down here, that business was muffled to a sound like distant water. Ada looked up from her book one evening, listening. "It sounds like the creek," she said, "in spring, when it's running fast." Eleanor listened. The wind above them filtered through 2 feet of packed earth and a barn floor, and everything she had built had become something almost peaceful. "Your father would have liked this," Eleanor said. It was the first time she had said his name or anything close to it in that space. It felt right to say it there in the thing she had built from the observation he had started. Ada looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a 12-year-old who understands more than she is supposed to understand about what her mother has been carrying. Then she went back to her book, and Eleanor went back to her numbers, and the wind above them did what it did, and they stayed warm. Aldrich Brenner had seen the signs before anyone else named them. He had been watching since the first week of November, with the eyes of a man who had spent 15 years underground in western Pennsylvania, learning to read the language of environments that were trying to kill you. That experience had given him a particular relationship to anticipation, a reflex built over years of scanning for the early indicators of dangerous changes in conditions before those changes became impossible to respond to. On the surface, on the Wyoming plains, the language was different, but the habit of reading it was the same. He had watched the elk. They had begun moving in the second week of November. Not the casual, seasonal drift that marked the ordinary transition of the herds, but something more purposeful, more continuous, moving south and east with a steadiness that did not include stopping to graze. Animals that migrate do not move like that when the conditions are ordinary. They move like that when something behind them is worse than whatever is ahead. He had watched the ravens. A congregation of them had gathered around his place for 4 days in the 3rd week of November. More than he had ever seen at one time in his years on that property, moving between the fence posts and the roof of the equipment shed, with the restless energy of creatures processing something they did not have words for either. And then, one morning they were gone. All of them between nightfall and sunrise, as though they had received a signal he had missed and acted on it immediately. He had watched the sky in the evenings. There was a color it took on in those last weeks of November that he had seen once before in the winter of 1880. And that he had never forgotten. Not the luminous gray of an ordinary overcast, which reflected the light behind the clouds and had a certain depth to it, a quality of silver. This gray was flat. This gray was the color of pewter that had been sitting in the back of a cabinet for 20 years, and had lost all its reflective quality, had become simply a surface that absorbed whatever light reached it and gave nothing back. He had seen that sky in 1880. He knew what had followed it. On a Tuesday afternoon in late November, Brenner rode out to the Prescott property to check on a fence line they shared along the northern boundary. He found Harlan and Clem Prescott working in the yard, and he pulled his horse up at the gate and told them without preamble that he believed they were going to see something serious before February was out. Something worth preparing for in ways that went beyond ordinary winter readiness. Harlan Prescott listened with the expression of a man who respects the source but has already decided the conclusion is excessive. "Every winter's serious out here, Brenner," he said. "Not every winter," Brenner said. "Some winters are different." He paused. "This will be different." He turned his horse and rode back north toward his own property. And here is the thing that would matter enormously in the months ahead. The thing that Brenner himself would not fully understand until he was standing in Eleanor Voss's underground room in the aftermath of the storm. He rode back to his property, and he prepared for a serious winter in the way he had always prepared for serious winters. He chipped more wood. He checked the insulation on the north wall of his barn. He laid in extra hay. He reinforced the windbreak on the eastern side of the structure. He did everything that experience and common sense suggested, and he did it thoroughly, with the precision of a man who does not do things by halves. What he did not do, what it would not occur to him in those weeks to do, was to think about the room beneath Eleanor Voss's barn floor and what it represented. He had been underground for 15 years. He had worked in mines where the temperature 40 feet below the surface stayed within a narrow range, year-round cool in summer, and startling in its relative mildness during the worst Pennsylvania winters. He had known men who built small warming alcoves in the rock walls of mine tunnels, not for storage but for shelter, because the rock itself served as a buffer between the men and the killing cold above ground. He knew this. He had lived this. The knowledge was as present in him as his own name. And yet, when he thought about preparing for the coming winter, he did not think about it. The knowledge sat in him like a tool in a drawer that you have not opened in so long you have forgotten it is there. He was a rancher now. He thought like a rancher. Ranchers insulated their barns and stacked their wood and hoped for the best. He went home and stacked more wood and did not think about what was 40 feet below the ground he was standing on. Eleanor was thinking about very little else. Through December, she refined the lower room. She added more insulation between the ceiling boards and the barn floor above, packing the gap with dried grass, and then with a layer of the clay-heavy soil that she had saved from the deepest section of the excavation, specifically for this purpose. She drove additional pegs into the planking for hanging coats and tools and the children's boots. She built a second shelf along the west wall for water containers, cutting notches in the planking to hold the barrels secure. The water was a specific concern. If the storm she was preparing for was as serious as the signs suggested, the pump might freeze. The pipes might freeze. Anything above ground might become inaccessible for days at a time, and a family and a collection of animals needed water in quantities that could not be easily improvised in the middle of a major storm. She filled every container she had. She filled the barrels on the lower shelf until they were almost too heavy to maneuver. She brought down the two largest cooking pots and filled those as well. She calculated how many days she could provide water for the animals and the children from what she had stored. And she calculated the number twice because the first answer seemed like more than enough. And she had learned to distrust answers that seemed like more than enough. Then she filled two more containers and put them in the corner. Ada helped her without being asked, hauling water from the pump in the yard during the middle hours of the day when the temperature was at its least severe, moving with the focused efficiency of a girl who has understood since she was old enough to understand anything that the work of survival is not optional and is not separate from love. It is love expressed in the only language the plains consistently honored. Owen worked on the stove. He had developed over the weeks of using the lower room an instinctive understanding of how the small iron box behaved, how much wood it wanted in a single feeding to achieve a stable burn rather than a hot surge followed by rapid cooling, how the flue affected the draw, how to read the color of the smoke coming from the vent, opening to know whether the combustion was clean or whether something needed adjusting. He was 9 years old, and he managed the stove the way natural mechanics manage mechanical things, without formal instruction by feel. Eleanor watched him and thought about Samuel, about the way that particular quality, the instinct for how things work, the patience to read a system before acting on it, had expressed itself in his father. She thought about the notebook on the shelf. She was going to need Owen's instincts before the winter was over. She was certain of this. On the second day of January 1889, Eleanor walked out of the house before sunrise and stood in the yard and looked at the sky for a long time. It was the sky Brenner had been watching. The pewter sky, the flat one, the one that did not reflect. She went back inside. She did not say anything to the children over breakfast. She ate her own food and drank her coffee and thought. Then she went to the barn and checked the lower room one more time. The water barrels, the wood supply, the stove, the vent flap, the trapdoor mechanism, the way a captain checks the ship's systems before a storm that is not yet visible but is already felt in the way the water moves. Everything was as she had left it. Everything was ready. She had brought the last of the older calves down the previous Tuesday. The lower room now housed 5 calves, 2 of the barn cats that had, like the mice before them, made their own decision about where they preferred to spend their nights, and enough wood in the corner stack to last, by her calculation, considerably longer than any storm she had yet seen on those plains. She added more wood anyway. She carried it down in armloads until the corner stack was as high as the ceiling would allow. Everett Halston stopped by that afternoon. Halston was a different kind of man from Harlan Prescott. Not warmer exactly, but more honest about the limits of his certainty, more willing to revise a position when the evidence required it. He had a face that showed his thinking, which Eleanor had always found useful in a neighbor. He stood in the barn looking at the trap door with an expression that had evolved over the months since he had first heard about the project. From skepticism through something like puzzlement into something closer to consideration. He did not say much. He watched Eleanor carry another armload of wood to the trap door and pass it down to Owen below. "How much wood does it use?" he asked. "In a bad night." Eleanor told him. She gave him the exact numbers from her notebook. How much on the coldest nights of November? How much on the average nights? How the total compared to what the main barn's corner stove consumed on the same nights. Halston was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic in the visible way he had. "That's less than a third," he said. "Less than a third," Eleanor confirmed. He looked at the trap door again. He looked at it for a long time. Then he put his hat back on and said he had better get back to his place before the light failed, and he rode out. And Eleanor watched him go with the specific attention of someone watching a man carry a thought home with him that he has not yet finished having. She went back to stacking wood. The week between the 1st of January and the 8th passed with a slowness that had a different quality from ordinary slowness. The temperature dropped incrementally day by day, not in dramatic plunges, but in the steady, patient accumulating way of something that is settling in for a long stay rather than passing through. The creek, which had been running thin but open through December, closed over entirely on the 5th. On the 6th, a shelf of ice formed along the south-facing wall of the barn, which was the sheltered side, the side that got whatever winter sun there was and did not melt during the midday hours the way such ice usually melted. Eleanor noted this in her notebook. She noted the creek. She noted the temperature at dawn and at midday and at nightfall. She noted that the cattle were eating more than usual, packing on whatever insulation they could, in the specific animal way of creatures responding to a signal their bodies were receiving, but that she could only read secondhand in their behavior. She noted that Owen, without being asked, had begun sleeping in his heaviest clothes. On the 8th of January, a Thursday, she looked at the sky from the porch in the late afternoon and called the children in early. The light was doing something she had not seen it do before, a quality of fading that was not the ordinary dimming of a winter evening, but something more complete, as though the sky was not just darkening but withdrawing, pulling its attention away from the surface of the world. "We'll go down tonight," she said. Ada looked at the sky. She looked at her mother. She nodded. Owen said, "How long?" "I don't know yet," Eleanor said. "Long enough that we bring everything." They had a system by now worked out over the weeks of using the lower room. Ada managed the food and the books and the lamp oil. Owen managed the stove supplies and the toolkit and the small box of items they might need for repairs. Eleanor managed the animals, checking each calf, making sure the water was adequate, doing the final round of the main barn before descending. They were below by the time the last light left the sky. Eleanor pulled the trapdoor shut above them and listened to the seal of it, the particular sound of the world above being closed out of the space below, being closed in, and felt something she had felt only once before in her life on the morning after Samuel's funeral, when she had woken before the children and stood in the kitchen in the dark and realized that the life she was now living was entirely of her own making, for better or worse, and that this was both the most frightening thing she had ever understood and the most clarifying. She was ready. Whatever was coming, she was ready. It came after midnight. She was not asleep when it arrived. She was sitting on the bench with her back against the east wall, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold in her hands, reading her notebook by lantern light when she felt it. Not heard it, felt it first. A change in the pressure of the air and the space around her, subtle enough that she would not have noticed it if she had not been paying the particular quality of attention she had trained herself to pay over 4 years of close observation. Then a moment later she heard it. The wind. She had heard Wyoming wind for 5 years. She had heard it in the fall when it came down from the north and pressed against the walls of the house with a steady, leaning weight. She had heard it in January when it turned mean when it found the gaps in the siding and drove itself through them with what felt like intention. She had heard it in the worst of the ordinary storms when it built to a pitch that made the barn groan on its foundation posts and sent small debris skittering across the yard in the dark. She had not heard it like this. This was not a pitch or a gust or even a sustained roar. This was something that occupied a different category of sound entirely. Something that was not quite weather in the ordinary sense of the word, because it had too much consistency, too much depth, too much of a quality she could only describe as geographical, as though the land itself had been given a voice and was using it to say something unambiguous about the conditions of its existence. Ada woke up. She sat upright on her pallet and looked at the ceiling of the room, the floor of the barn above them, with an expression that was not fear, but was its near neighbor. The look of someone encountering a sound they have no previous category for. Owen slept through the first 10 minutes of it. He slept the way 9-year-old boys sleep when they are tired and have been working hard, which is to say completely, absolutely in a way that the world has to work for. Then something in the sustained pitch of the sound above apparently reached him, and he rolled over and opened his eyes and said with the uncanny practicality of a child who has been raised not to waste words on panic, "Is the barn still there?" "The barn is still there," Eleanor said. "Go back to sleep." He looked at the ceiling. He listened for a moment. Then he turned back over and impossibly went back to sleep. Eleanor looked at Ada. Ada looked at her. "It sounds different from down here," Ada said quietly. "It does. Like it's not as angry." Eleanor considered this. "It's just as angry," she said. "We're just not in its way anymore." Ada absorbed this and lay back down on her pallet. Eleanor pulled the blanket up around her daughter's shoulders and sat back on the bench and listened to the storm conduct its business above them. The stove burned steadily. The temperature in the room held at the point it had reached 2 hours before the storm arrived, cool by indoor standards. Cool enough that you wanted a sweater, but not a coat, not gloves. The earthen walls gave nothing away. They had made their arrangement with temperature long before this particular storm had been anything more than a disturbance in the upper atmosphere. And they kept their arrangement with indifferent steadiness. Eleanor fed the stove at the intervals Owen had taught her. The intervals that maintained the steady burn rather than the dramatic surge and fade. She watched the flame through the iron grate. She drank another cup of coffee that she made fresh and actually finished this time. She thought about Samuel's notebook, about the fact that he had seen this, not this storm, not this room, but the principle of it, the possibility of it, and had not had time to make it real. She had made it real for him. She hoped in the way that she had learned to hope for things she could not verify that Somewhere in whatever came after the specific noise and struggle of a life, he knew that. The storm screamed above her. The earth was quiet around her. She held her coffee in both hands and she stayed. The first full day passed in a rhythm she had not entirely anticipated. She had expected the confinement to feel like confinement. She had built the room to be functional, not comfortable, and she had thought in her practical, unsentimental way that the experience of being in it for an extended period would have a quality of endurance to it, of gritting through. Instead, it had a quality of settlement. There was, she realized, a strange liberty in having no options. Above ground, even in a bad storm, there was always the question of whether you should do something. Whether you should check the barn. Whether you should bring in more wood. Whether the cattle needed something you could not see from inside the house. The storm presented the question of action, even when action was impossible. And the impossibility of action, when you could still conceive of it, created a specific kind of helpless anxiety. Down here, there were no options. The trapdoor was shut. The world above was inaccessible. There was nothing to decide about because there was nothing that could be decided. There was only the stove and the animals and the children and the walls that held their temperature and the work of the next hour. She taught Owen his multiplication tables through the afternoon. She had been meaning to do this for 2 months and had not found the concentrated time. Now she had it, and he received it with the focused willingness of a boy who has nothing competing for his attention. And by the end of the day, he had the 7s and 8s solid in a way that she suspected he would not lose. Ada read. She was working through a collection of essays that Eleanor had obtained from the lending library in town the previous fall. And she read with the serious absorption that Eleanor recognized as her daughter, at her most content, not performing contentment, not managing boredom, but genuinely quietly occupied. The calves in the corner stood with their heads down, in the posture of calm animals. One of the barn cats had arranged itself on the corner of Ada's pallet with the proprietary ease of an animal that has decided this situation suits it perfectly. The other had found a position near the base of the stove, not too near, but near enough to receive the warmth without any of the risk, and had not moved from it in 6 hours. Eleanor recorded the wood consumption at midday, less than she had projected. She added a note to her notebook. The mass of earth in the walls is functioning as a buffer. The stove is not fighting the cold. It is maintaining an equilibrium that the walls are already holding. This is the thing. She underlined it. This is the thing. The second day was when Everett Halston came. She heard his footsteps before she heard the trap door. The specific sound of boots on the barn floor above them, heavier than a child's step. The deliberate tread of a large man, moving carefully in an unfamiliar space. Owen looked up from his arithmetic. Ada closed her book. Eleanor put her coffee down and looked at the ceiling. The trap door opened. Cold air fell through the opening in a rush. The sharp, savage cold of the storm above pressing through the gap like something that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. And in the rectangle of gray light above them, a face appeared. A man's face red with cold ice crystals in his beard, eyes squinting against the contrast between the darkness above and the lantern light below. Everett Halston. His expression when he found Eleanor's face in the light below was the expression of a man who has been certain about something and has just been confronted with evidence that his certainty was incorrectly placed. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the stove, He looked at Ada sitting on her pallet with her book in her lap. He looked at the calves standing calmly in the corner. He looked at Eleanor on her bench with the coffee cup in her hands perfectly still, watching him with the patient attention of a woman who has been waiting for this moment for quite some time. "Lord," he said. He climbed down. The trapdoor fell most of the way shut behind him, and Eleanor let it rest that way. The warmth below was not something to sacrifice if it could be helped. He stood in the center of the space and did not take his coat off immediately. He was taking inventory with his eyes the way a practical man takes inventory when he encounters a situation that is operating according to principles he has not previously applied to the relevant problem. He looked at the ceiling, the packing she had done between the ceiling boards and the barn floor, the clay and grass filling every gap. He looked at the walls, the planking, the steadiness of them, the absence of frost. He looked at the vent flap on the south wall just barely cracked, letting the faintest trace of outside air circulate without letting the cold pile in. Then he took his coat off. He held it in his hands and stood there in the cool, still air of the room Eleanor Voss had dug out of the Wyoming earth with a pickaxe and a shovel, and the understanding her dead husband had started to reach and she had finished. He held his coat in his hands, and he pressed one bare palm flat against the earthen wall. He held it there for a long moment. "Lord," he said again quietly to the wall itself. Eleanor had a second cup of coffee ready. She had thought he might come, and she had thought this might be how it went, and she had prepared accordingly. She held it out. He took it without speaking and drank it slowly, still looking around. When he finally spoke, it was not a long speech. Everett Halston was not a man who made long speeches, which was one of the things Eleanor had always found reasonable about him. He told her that his cattle were in the barn above with extra hay piled against the north wall, and the corner stove running nearly without stop for 2 days, and the animals were still off their feed, still restless in the way that animals are restless when they are cold and cannot get away from the cold. He told her that Dorothea had kept the children in the kitchen with the main house stove burning through both nights, and they had still slept in their coats the first night. He told her that he had burned through nearly half his wood supply in 48 hours. He said these things not as complaints, but as data delivered with the precision of a man who has been watching his situation carefully and knows exactly what the numbers are. Eleanor listened. She did not say she was sorry for his difficulty. She did not say she had told him so. She did not say any of the things that the moment technically permitted her to say. She said, "How are the Brenner animals?" Halston shook his head slowly. "Don't know. Haven't been able to get that far." He paused. "Braun Brenner, I mean, he's been at this longer than any of us. He'll be managing." Eleanor nodded. She thought about Brenner's question the first day she had started the excavation, the air exchange. "How are you managing it?" She thought about what it meant that a man who had asked that question had gone home and not dug his own room. She did not say this. She looked at the vent flap on the south wall. Halston was sitting on the low bench now in the corner near the stove. His coat was over his knee. He had a color coming back into his face that had not been there when he climbed down. He stayed for the better part of an hour. When he finally climbed back up, he paused with his head at the level of the barn floor, half in and half out of the lower room, and looked back down at Eleanor. He did not say she had been right. Men like Everett Halston did not say that exactly, not in words, not when the rightness of someone else's position had cost them something in their own certainty. But he looked at the room, at the stove, and the animals, and the children, and the walls that held their patient temperature, with the focused attention of a man who is memorizing something he intends to use. Then he pulled himself the rest of the way up, and the trap door settled closed, and his footsteps moved across the barn floor and out into the storm. And Eleanor Voss sat in the quiet below the earth, and held her coffee in both hands, and listened to the world above doing what it was gonna do regardless. And she stayed exactly where she was. The stove burned steadily. The walls held. The children were warm. The earth kept its decision, the one it had made long before any person had ever set foot on this particular corner of Wyoming. The one it would keep long after Eleanor and her children and Everett Halston and Aldrich Brenner and the Prescott brothers and everyone else who had lived and argued and built and doubted on this stretch of plains had returned to it. Above them, the storm gave everything it had. Below it, barely registered. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. Eleanor knew it before she opened the trap door. She knew it the way she had learned to know things about the world above her. Not through sight, not through any instrument, but through the specific quality of absence. The sound that had been the constant condition of their lives for 72 hours, that sustained geographical roar, that had been as present and as total as the sound of your own heartbeat, had changed its character sometime in the hours before dawn. Not stopped, it was still there. Still present, but it had lost the weight behind it. The sense of inexhaustible reserves of a thing that was drawing on a supply with no visible bottom. It had become in the early morning hours something finishing rather than something ongoing. She had been awake for most of the night, sitting on her bench with the notebook open in her lap, and the small stove clicking through its slow burn cycle, listening to the gradual modulation of the world above her, the way a sailor listens to a sea that is deciding whether to continue a storm or relent. By the time the gray light of morning began to filter through the thin gap at the edge of the trapdoor, she knew. She climbed up the ladder and lifted the trapdoor, and the light that came through was the specific white light of a world covered in snow, with the sun newly out behind it. The kind of light that is not just bright but actively intense, that has a physical quality of pressure to it, that you cannot look at directly for the first few seconds after days of barn-lit dimness. She stood in the barn and let her eyes adjust. The cattle in the main space shifted and moved toward her, the instinctive motion of animals that have been in confinement and are ready for something to happen. She went down the row of them, checking each one, running her hands along their flanks and under their jaws and along the bones of their hips, where condition shows itself first in bad times. In bad, they were cold. They were hungry. Their water buckets had frozen solid at some point in the second night, and they had been without water for longer than she would have liked. But they were standing. They were steady. Not one of them showed the particular sunken quality around the eyes that signaled the kind of physiological stress that a serious Wyoming cold snap could produce in animals that had spent it exposed. She went back to the trapdoor and called down, "It's over. Come up when you're ready." Ada came up first, blinking in the light with her book tucked under her arm, which told Eleanor that she had been reading until the last possible moment. Owen came up second, moving with the compressed energy of a boy who has been in a small space for 3 days and has opinions about this. He walked the length of the barn in 4 long strides, turned around, and walked it back. "Owen," Eleanor said. "I know," he said. "I'm just walking." She let him walk. She went to the barn door and lifted the latch and pushed. And for a moment the door resisted. There was snow packed against the base of it. Fine, wind-driven snow that had found the gap at the bottom and built up against it in the hours of the worst gusts. And then it gave, and she stepped out into the yard. The cold hit her immediately. The full surface cold, the kind she had been insulated from for 3 days. It was extraordinary in its intensity, the kind of cold that declares itself as a serious and immediate fact. The moment it contacts skin that does not ask you to consider it, but simply informs you of its position. She stood in it and let it inform her. And then she looked around at what the storm had left behind. The yard was transformed in the way that only a major winter storm transforms a landscape, not just covered, but restructured the familiar shapes of fence posts and equipment. And the woodpile made strange and new by the drifts that had built up against and around them. The woodpile was a white mound. The fence line to the east was visible only by the tops of the posts, the wire buried entirely. A section of the corral fence on the north side had come down the post, uprooted by the weight of snow on the rails, and the rails lay at angles in the drift like something a giant had carelessly discarded. She would deal with the fence. She would dig out the woodpile. She would chip the ice from the cattle's water buckets and get the pump running again. There was a full inventory of damage and recovery work that would take the better part of a week. And she knew this and accepted it with the equanimity of someone for whom recovery work after a major weather event was simply the next chapter in a story that had no other chapters available. But first, she stood in the white yard, in the intense light and the serious cold, and she did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She assessed. Her cattle, all of them, including the calves that had spent 3 days in the room below the barn, were in better condition than she had expected. The calves, in fact, were in considerably better condition than she had any right to expect, given their age and size, and the severity of what had happened above them while they stood in their straw-bedded corner and breathed the stable air of the underground room. Her firewood reserve was down, but not alarmingly so. Her water supply, thanks to the barrels she had filled before the storm, had held. Her children were pale from 3 days without proper sunlight, and they were hungry for something other than the food she could prepare on a small iron stove. But they were healthy, steady, and in Owen's case, visibly eager to run. She thought about the numbers in her notebook. The wood consumption over 3 days. The condition of the animals. The temperature she had maintained with a stove that would have been inadequate to heat a large room by any ordinary measure. She thought about Everett Halston's face when he had pressed his hand against the earthen wall. Then she went back inside to start the recovery work. She did not hear about Aldrich Brenner until 2 days after the storm broke. It was Robert Finch, the man who ran the small trading post 6 miles south, who told her when she rode in for supplies. He said it the way people on the plains delivered difficult news without preamble, without softening, with the directness of a community that had learned that softening difficult information was a luxury that the conditions of their lives did not reliably support. Brenner had lost 4 animals, 2 of his oldest cows and 2 of the youngest calves. They had been found in the barn when the storm broke, gone in the way that animals go when the cold is sustained and deep enough to simply outpace whatever reserves they have. Not violent, not dramatic, just finished. Eleanor received this information and held it. She did not say what she was thinking immediately because what she was thinking was too large and too complicated for the kind of quick response that a conversation at a trading post counter permits. She paid for her supplies and loaded them onto the horse and rode home and thought about it the whole way back across the wide-open, brutally lit plains. Aldrich Brenner. He had come to her barn before she was a quarter of the way through the excavation. He had stood at the edge of the hole she was digging, and he had asked the right question. Not whether she was crazy, not whether the idea made sense, not whether the neighbors would approve, but the one functional technical question that revealed a mind that had already done the preliminary calculation and moved directly to the problem that needed solving. The air exchange. How are you managing it? He had known, not just that her idea had merit. He had known in some part of himself that he had not fully accessed that the principle she was working with was real. He had lived inside that principle for 15 years underground in Pennsylvania, working in tunnels where the rock walls held their temperature, and the miners knew to get close to the wall when the surface above was freezing, and the coal dust was not enough to keep a man from going hypothermic. He had known, and he had asked the right question, and then he had gone home and prepared for winter, in the way he had always prepared for winter without connecting what he knew about underground temperature to what Eleanor was building without reaching into the drawer where the old knowledge sat and taking it out and using it. And he had lost 4 animals. Eleanor thought about this for a long time. She thought about it not with anger and not with satisfaction. Neither of those would have been honest. And Eleanor Voss was above most things honest with herself. She thought about it with something that felt like a specific and particular grief. The grief of watching a person who knew the right answer fail to use it. Not because they were foolish. Not because they lacked the capacity, but because the path from knowing something to using it is longer and less direct than it appears from the outside. She had been the outside. She had watched Samuel write in his notebook and had not asked him what he was thinking about, had not sat beside him and said, "Tell me what you see when you look at that fence post hole." She had missed it too, almost. She had only caught it because she found the notebook after he was gone, and finding it when he was gone had a different quality from finding it when he was present. It had a quality of obligation that ordinary discovery does not. She put the supplies away and went to check on the calves. And then she sat at the kitchen table in the low afternoon light and wrote in her notebook for a long time. Brenner came on a Thursday, 4 days after the storm broke. He rode up alone in the mid-morning, tied his horse at the post, and walked to the barn door with the deliberate, unhurried step of a man who has decided what he is going to say and is prepared to say it without elaboration. Eleanor was in the barn working on the section of floor she had been resealing since the storm. Some of the clay packing between the ceiling planks and the barn floor had been disturbed by the weight of snow on the barn roof and needed to be repacked and smoothed. She heard him come in. She straightened up and looked at him. He was 60 years old, and he looked it that morning in a way that he did not always look at the specific age that settles into a man's face when he has absorbed a loss that goes beyond the financial. He had lost animals he had raised. On a working ranch, animals are not pets, but they are not abstractions either. They are years of work and attention, and the particular relationship that develops between a person and a creature they have tended through every season of several years. Losing them is not a sentiment. It is a concrete subtraction from a life that was built around their presence. He stood in the center of the barn and looked at her. "I lost 4, he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "Robert Finch told me." A pause. Brenner looked at the trapdoor in the barn floor. He looked at it for a moment with an expression she could not fully read. And then he looked back at her. "I want to see what you built," he said. "If you'll show me." She pulled the trapdoor open and descended the ladder, and he followed her down. He went through the space the way she had expected him to go through it, the way a man who has spent 15 years underground goes through any underground space, which is methodically and with specific attention to specific things. He ran his hand along the plank walls, checking the joinery. He looked at the drainage channel along the north wall and followed it with his eye to the sump in the corner. He examined the ceiling, the beam placement, the planking, the packing she had layered between the planks and the floor above. He moved to the vent flap and opened and closed it twice, checking the pivot mechanism and the angle of the channel it opened onto. He was at the stove last. He looked at the stovepipe where it entered the ceiling, how it was sealed, the flashing she had hammered around the penetration point. He put his hand near the pipe and held it there. He did all of this in silence. Eleanor stood against the east wall and watched and did not speak, because it was not a moment that required speech. And she had learned in the years since Samuel's death that one of the most useful things a person can do in a moment that does not require speech is to refrain from providing it. Finally, Brenner turned and looked at her. His expression had settled into something that she recognized, having seen it occasionally on the faces of practical men confronting evidence that has rearranged their understanding. Not embarrassment, not humility in the performed sense, but the specific look of a mind that is completing a calculation. It should have completed earlier and acknowledging the gap between when it should have been done and when it was. "I should have listened to what you were saying," he said, "from the beginning." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She thought about several things she could say. She chose the one that seemed most useful. "I would be glad to help you dig," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, not in a man like Brenner, but the precursor to one, the internal recognition that the offer had been made in exactly the spirit in which it needed to be made. "I'd be grateful for that," he said. He did not move immediately to go back up the ladder. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a small book. Not a notebook in the way that Samuel's had been. Not a lined journal, but something older and smaller. A pocket ledger with a worn leather cover that had the quality of something handled daily for a long time, and then put away and not handled for a long time after that. He held it in his hands for a moment, looking at it. "I worked in the mines in Pennsylvania," he said, "before I came out here. 15 years. He paused. "We had in the tunnels at depth, we had what you have here. Not built, not designed as a room, but as a fact of the environment. The rock walls held their temperature. The men knew to work close to the walls in the worst cold snaps. We knew that 40 feet down the rock was not as cold as the surface." He turned the ledger over in his hands. "I wrote some of this down years ago. Notes about how the mine environment worked, what affected the air, what affected the temperature. Things I was thinking about." He paused again, longer this time. "I had forgotten that I knew this." He looked up at her. Not forgot in the way of forgetting a name or a date, he said. Forgot in the way of I became a different kind of man on the surface. I thought about cattle and fence lines and grain prices. I stopped thinking like a man underground. He looked at the earthen walls around him. You had never been underground. You found it by watching, by following what you saw, until it told you something. He held the ledger out to her. She took it. She opened it to the first page. The writing was in German, in the small, precise hand of a man who had been educated carefully and retained the habit of that education through years that might have eroded it in someone less deliberate. She could not read German, but she could see the diagram's small detail drawn with the accuracy of someone recording something they needed to remember precisely. Cross-sections of tunnel walls, temperature notations at different depths, arrows indicating airflow, notations about the relationship between tunnel depth and surface weather, between rock composition and temperature stability. Everything she had worked out by observation over 4 years here, in a different language in a pocket ledger from 15 years before she had started digging. She turned the pages slowly. Brenner stood beside her and looked at the pages with her and didn't speak. After a while, she looked up at him. "Could you teach me the drainage system?" she said. "Mine isn't right on the north wall. I've been bailing the sump more than I should be." He looked at the north wall. He looked at the sump in the corner. He was already solving it. She could see it in the way he looked at the problem. Not as a problem that needed discussing, but as a system that needed a specific adjustment. "Yes," he said, "I can show you that." They stayed in the room for another hour. He showed her the drainage sketching in the dirt floor with a stick. And then they went up and he looked at the north side of the barn's exterior and showed her where the water was entering the soil and what direction it was moving and how to redirect it. She asked questions. He answered them. He asked one question about the ceiling insulation, whether she had used any clay in the packing, and she told him what she had used, and he nodded and said the clay was important, that it held differently from grass or straw, that it remembered the temperature. She wrote this down. When he left, he took his ledger with him. She had offered to return it, and he had taken it with the understanding that he would bring it back, that she should have more time with it, that there were things in it she would want to work through more carefully. He rode north toward his place on the small rise with the slow, upright posture of a man who is thinking. Eleanor stood in the barn door and watched him go and thought about the specific quality of knowledge that had just been exchanged. Not the transfer of information in one direction as teaching usually moves, but something more reciprocal, more honest about how understanding actually accumulates in people who spend their lives paying attention to the world around them. He had given her the language for something she had already found. She had given him or given back to him the knowledge that what he had learned underground was not separate from who he was. On the surface, that it was still there, still usable, still real. The drawer was open again. The tool was back in his hand. The summer of 1889 moved through that stretch of Wyoming with the particular unhurried warmth of a season following a difficult winter. The way that easier times always feel more itself after something hard has preceded them. Everett Halston began digging in July. He came to Eleanor first in the long June evenings when the light lasted until nearly 9, and they could sit on the porch after the work was done and talk through the details with the unhurried thoroughness that the design deserved. His barn was larger than hers, his cattle herd more than twice the size, and the room he needed to build was proportionally more ambitious. They worked through it together. The dimensions, the depth, the ceiling structure, the drainage, the ventilation. He was a good listener, Everett Halston. He had always been good at listening once he had decided a thing was worth listening to. And he had made that decision about Eleanor's knowledge somewhere, in the hour he had spent in the underground room during the storm, sitting on her bench with his coat off and his hand against the earthen wall. He brought the stove question to her specifically because the stove in his planned room would need to be larger than hers, and he was unsure about the sizing of the flue relative to the combustion volume. She did not know the answer from experience, but she thought it through with him, and they reached a solution that both of them found convincing. And she wrote it in her notebook, and he wrote it in his. She did not charge him for this. It did not occur to her to charge him. This was how knowledge moved on the frontier, and she had learned the mechanism of that movement in the years since Samuel died, not from books, not from institutions, but from the accumulated experience of people doing things, and other people watching them work, and the whole community rearranging its understanding around the evidence. Clem Prescott came in July, a week after Halston had broken ground. He came alone in the afternoon on a weekday without his brother, and this was itself a form of statement that Eleanor registered and did not comment on. He tied his horse and came into the barn and stood looking at the trap door with the expression of a man who has been thinking about something for months and has finally given himself permission to act on the thinking. He was quieter than she had expected. The Prescott brothers, in her experience of them, had a combined volume that was larger than either of them individually. They fed off each other's certainty and amplified it. Clem alone was a different person. He asked sensible questions. He looked at the drainage system on the north wall exterior with genuine attention. When Eleanor showed him the vent flap and explained the angle and the size, he asked about the direction of the prevailing wind and how she had decided on south-facing. And she explained her reasoning, and he nodded, and asked a follow-up question that revealed he had understood the reasoning and was extending it. She liked him better, she found, than she had liked either of the Prescott brothers before. Harlan came 2 weeks later. He came in the late afternoon alone, and he tied his horse at the post and walked into the barn without a great deal of ceremony. He looked at the trap door. He looked at Eleanor. "How deep does it need to be?" he said. Not, "I was wrong." Not, "You were right." Not, "I'm sorry about what I said about things that are dead being kept underground." Just, how deep does it need to be? The question of a man who has moved past the argument to the practical problem, which is Eleanor had come to understand its own form of acknowledgement. She told him. She told him the depth and the dimensions and the ventilation requirements and the drainage considerations and the ceiling construction and the stove sizing and everything else he needed to know. And she told him all of it in the same straightforward voice she would have used if he had asked her on the first day before any of the other things had been said. He listened. He did not write anything down, but she could see him retaining it, storing it in the particular way that men who have worked with their hands all their lives retain practical information, not as words, but as spatial and procedural understanding, as a sequence of actions rather than a sequence of sentences. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I'll come back if I have questions," he said. "You know where I am," she said. He put his hat back on and walked out. She watched him go. She thought about the evening he had ridden past her barn and seen the light in the window and not stopped, not known that the whole family was already underground, already in the room she had been building while he was telling people at the feed store about coal miners and root sellers. She thought about what it cost a man like Harlan Prescott to ride to a woman's barn and ask a practical question about a thing he had publicly mocked. She decided it had probably cost him something considerable and that the cost itself was a form of the answer she had never needed him to give in words. By the autumn of 1889, 3 of the 4 neighboring properties had underground rooms in various stages of completion. Aldrich Brenner built the deepest one. He hired his nephew from Cheyenne to help with the heavy excavation and brought to the project everything he had learned in 15 years underground, plus everything he had discussed with Eleanor through the summer. The drainage system he installed was genuinely superior to hers. He had added a second channel that she had not thought of running at a compound angle that kept the water moving even in the freeze-thaw cycles of early spring, when a simple single-direction channel tended to clog. The ventilation was more sophisticated too, a 2-vent system with opposing flaps that allowed for directional control of airflow depending on the wind direction above. When he had it finished, he came to Eleanor's place and asked her to come see it. She went. She went down into the room he had built and walked through it with the attention she gave to all spaces that were doing serious work. And she saw the drainage immediately and understood it immediately and stood looking at it for a moment with the particular feeling of looking at something that is better than what you have, and knowing that this is good rather than threatening that this is how the work improves. "The second channel," she said. "Yes," he said. "Explain it to me." He explained it. She asked questions. She rebuilt her own drainage system the following spring, incorporating his improvement, and the sump in the north corner of her room did not need to be bailed once in the entire following winter. This was how it went between them for years. She would bring him a problem she was working on, and he would think about it with the specific intelligence of a man who had solved similar problems in a different context. He would show her something he had developed, and she would apply it and refine it, and occasionally improve it in ways he had not anticipated, coming at the problem from outside the mining framework, with eyes that saw different things. They did not call it collaboration. They did not call it anything. It was simply 2 people who were paying attention to the same set of problems, and were both too practical to waste the opportunity that proximity provided. Ada was 31 years old when she dug her first underground room. She had married a man named William Tanner, a quiet man Eleanor's word for him said, with the specific approval that the word carried when Eleanor Voss said it, who ran a small cattle operation 40 miles west of the homestead where Ada had grown up. The property had a barn that William had built himself, solid and adequate, and it had everything that a working ranch needed except the one thing Ada had known since she was 12 years old, that a ranch needed most. She did not hire anyone to dig it. She and William dug it together in the late summer of their second year on the property, working in the same rhythm of morning excavation and afternoon recovery that Eleanor had established. And William was a good partner for this work, in the way that quiet men tend to be good partners for this work. Patient with the problem and not interested in cutting corners that would compromise the result. Ada did not consult her mother's notes. She did not need to. The room was in her hands, and her body as thoroughly as it was in any notebook. The depth, the wall angle, the ceiling construction, the ventilation angle, the stove sizing. She had been in the room at the Voss homestead enough times through enough winters in enough different conditions that the understanding was structural in her, built into the way she thought about shelter, the way that language is built into the way a person thinks about communication. She built it right the first time. The winter of their third year on that property was not, as it happened, a severe one. The room went largely unused for serious weather, but Ada kept calves in it through December and January anyway, and she tracked the wood consumption and the animal condition the way her mother had tracked it in a notebook she kept on the shelf in the kitchen, and the numbers were what she had expected them to be because they were what the numbers always were. She wrote to Eleanor that winter. Not about the room specifically, she did not need to explain it to Eleanor, and Eleanor would not have needed the explanation. She wrote about the property and the cattle, and William and the ordinary progress of a life being built in a new place. Near the end of the letter, she mentioned in a single sentence that she had dug the room under the barn in August and that it had come out well. Eleanor wrote back a long letter about the winter on the homestead, about Owen's plans for the following year, about the second drainage channel that Brenner had shown her, and that she recommended Ada consider for the north wall if the soil on the Tanner property ran wet. She described the technical detail precisely in the spare functional language of her notebook entries, the language of a practical mind, communicating practical information to someone who will use it. Near the end of her letter, she wrote, "Your father would have been glad to see it. He knew the ground had something to offer. You took it the rest of the way." Owen Voss became a builder, not an architect in the formal sense. He never had the schooling for credentials, and credentials were not what the frontier valued in any case. He became the kind of builder that the plains produced in those years, a man who understood structure from the ground up in the most literal sense, who could read a site and understand what it wanted to do and work with that rather than against it. He built barns and houses and occasionally churches across a two-county area for 30 years. Every barn he built had an underground room. This was not something he advertised or theorized about. It was simply what a barn was in his understanding, the way a house had a kitchen. People hired him because his barns were the ones that came through the worst winters with the fewest losses, and they eventually understood, if they spent any time thinking about it, that this was not accident but design, that the man they had hired was building from a set of principles that the standard practice did not include. He did not, when asked about it, explain it as his mother's idea. He did not explain it as anyone's idea. He described it the way he thought about it, which was as a fact about how soil and temperature work, as a principle of physics rather than a story about a person. The ground holds its temperature below a certain depth. This is simply true the way the strength of an arch is simply true. The way water runs to its own level is simply true. You use it because it is there, because the work of surviving a serious winter is hard enough, without ignoring a fact that is free, that requires nothing from you, except the willingness to go far enough down to find it. When people pressed him, "Where did you learn this? Who showed you?" he would be quiet for a moment and then say, "My mother figured it out. She had good reasons to." The Voss homestead was sold in 1907. Eleanor had kept it for 18 years after Samuel's death, which is a thing that the people who had predicted she would not manage it alone found when they thought about it later to be a certain kind of answer to a question they had asked without fully meaning to. She sold it not because she could not continue, but because Ada had asked her to come west to the Tanner property to be closer to the grandchildren, who were now old enough to benefit from the kind of proximity that letters could not substitute for. She went. She took Samuel's notebook and her own notebooks and the small iron stove that she had ordered from Cheyenne in the spring of 1888, and that had served the underground room through 19 Wyoming winters, without once failing to do what she needed it to do. The man who bought the Voss homestead was a rancher from Nebraska who was expanding his operation westward. He was a capable man and a practical one, and he looked at the barn and the underground room with the evaluating attention of a buyer who is assessing what he is getting. He used the room for 3 winters. Then he built a larger barn on the south side of the property, and the old barn was repurposed for equipment storage, and the underground room was not convenient to the new arrangement. And in the spring of the 4th year after he bought the property, he had the room filled in. This is how it goes. The specific structure did not survive. Structures rarely do on the plains where the economics of land use are unsentimentally practical, and no building is preserved past the point of its usefulness. The hole Eleanor Voss dug was not a monument. It was a tool. And when the conditions of its use changed, the tool was put aside. But the knowledge did not go with it. The knowledge was in Ada Tanner's hands in the room she had built under her own barn 40 miles west. It was in the habits of Owen Voss's construction practice, in the dozens of barns he built across 2 counties over 30 years. It was in Everett Halston's barn, and in the room Clem Prescott built the summer after the storm, and in the deep, carefully engineered space that Aldrich Brenner had constructed with his nephew's help, and the knowledge from his Pennsylvania pocket ledger. It was in the notebooks, Eleanor's notebooks, which she carried west with her and which her grandchildren eventually inherited, though they could not always read the handwriting and could not always follow the reasoning because they had not lived through the winters that the reasoning addressed. But they kept the notebooks. They knew they were important even if the specific importance had become historical by the time it passed to them. Something their grandmother had done. Something she had known. Something that had mattered to the people who were there. In the February of 1889, a woman pressed her hands against an earthen wall and understood something that the people around her would not understand until the worst 3 days of the decade had already passed, and they had seen it for themselves. She was not a scientist. She had no instruments beyond a notebook, and her own body no credential beyond 5 years of close and honest observation. No authority beyond the specific authority of someone who has followed an idea all the way through and come out the other side with something real in her hands. She had finished what her husband started. She had done it alone through a season of ridicule and a season of doubt with 2 children and a herd of cattle and a sense of obligation to an idea that had come to her through a fence post hole in February and a dead man's notebook, and the patient bodies of 7 mice who had found their way into a room before she had finished building it. She had used the earth the way the earth could be used, not fighting the cold with fire alone, not spending herself against the conditions of her life in the losing battle that pure opposition always is, but finding what the ground had to offer and going far enough down to receive it. The principle was simple. The application was not. And the willingness to follow the idea all the way through past the laughter and the doubt and the specific loneliness of being certain about something that no one around you can yet see. That willingness was the hardest thing. That willingness was in the end what it had actually required. Eleanor Voss lived to see her grandchildren grow to the age where they could begin to understand what she had built, though they had not been there for the building. She lived long enough to see the principles she had worked out in Wyoming spread in the way practical truth spread on working land from hand to hand and barn to barn and generation to generation. She lived long enough on one evening near the end of her life to stand in the underground room that Ada and William Tanner had built under their barn on the property 40 miles west of where the original had been, and to press both hands flat against the earthen wall, and to close her eyes. The wall held its temperature. It was cool and steady and entirely indifferent to the season above it, to the wind and the cold and the variable surface fury of a Wyoming February. It did not swing. It had never swung. Not once, not in all the years that people had been living on the surface above it, without understanding what was available below. It had simply been there, holding its decision, waiting for someone to go far enough down to find it. Eleanor Voss had gone far enough. She stood in her daughter's barn, with her eyes closed and her hands against the wall, and she thought about Samuel's handwriting on a page she had read so many times she no longer needed to open the notebook to see it. The ground does not swing. I want to know what use a person could make of that. She had found out. She had found out for both of them. She kept her hands against the wall for a long moment, feeling the temperature that did not change, the steadiness that asked nothing and gave everything it had to give to anyone willing to be still enough to receive it. Then she opened her eyes and she climbed the ladder and she went back up into the world.